thinking about a relationship you have right now, that maybe there's some avoidance, maybe there's some resentment. There are some of those clues, those emotional clues that maybe it's time to set a boundary. That this step 2 is going to be one of the things that likely pulls you guys, my people pleasers, my friends and family, with conflict avoidance. This is going to be one of the things that pulls you guys over the line and makes you feel safe to set this boundary. And we need you to feel safe. Hello, my beautiful friends. My name is Dr. Becc.
And I am Kristeen Barker, and this is Am I Doing It Wrong? A podcast for doctors by doctors. Dr. Becc is a mindset coach and medical doctor who specialises in liberating driven professional women from the limitations of perfectionism, imposter syndrome, and people pleasing. She's basically the cheat code for getting out of your own way, showing up authentically, and living a life you're proud of.
And Kristeen is a medical educator and nephrologist who creates resources for doctors in training that I truly think are an unfair advantage. She makes complex topics super simple and takes the pain and uncertainty out of passing your medical exams. Kristeen and I connected a few years ago via our online platforms, and over the years we've discussed countless highs, lows, and in-betweens of doctor life. And in doing so, we've experienced firsthand the power of vulnerable conversations to show us where we're getting in our own way and underestimating our capacity.
So we want you to be part of the conversation and experience these same results. Every week on the pod, we'll be bringing you conversations which shine light in dark places, normalise the doctor journey, ease unnecessary suffering, and give you actionable steps to thrive in all facets of your life. So grab a cuppa and get cozy for this week's episode of Am I Doing It Wrong? The podcast for doctors by doctors. Hello, welcome back, our beautiful friends, our doctor humans. This is episode 3 of our mini-series on boundaries. So far in the series, we've unpacked what a boundary is, how to recognize your boundaries, how to plan for how you're going to show up in your boundaries. And now we're going to do a crucial step, which is the part where we actually set the boundary. And I'm sure this is the part that's giving you all nightmares, right? This is the part that we think, how am I going to do this? How am I going to approach this? This is scary. Maybe it's better I just don't set the boundary. Maybe it's better that everything stays the same. I continue to build resentment and avoidance strategies. Maybe that's the answer. But we don't want that to be your answer. And Dr. Becc has some strategies. So Becc, over to you. Tell us how to do this with love and integrity in a healthy, happy way.
In an empowered way. Please promise me, guys, that you will not do this thing where you say things like, when Kristeen's saying it's going to get a bit hard, the pressure's starting to build, you're a bit nervous, that I want to avoid is creeping in, and you're like, it's not that important to me. Well, it seems more important to them. Like, they seem to care a lot more about this thing or being this way or continuing this. So, maybe I can just be relaxed. I can be easygoing. I can accommodate. I can adjust. I can be second priority again. Please, guys. Please don't do that for us. You've gotten this far in this series, and we are here to support you. Ask us your questions about anything that's feeling hard about boundaries, because as we've been iterating throughout, boundaries are loving, boundaries are beautiful things, and boundaries are empowering things. And when it comes to long-term relationships, as opposed to like me and that guy at the pub, when it comes to long-term relationships, boundaries are something that will be inevitable in these relationships. Optional with the guy at the pub, whatever you do, you may or may not see them ever again. Sit on the other side of the bar if you like. But in your long-term relationships, I believe, and in the way that I look at relationships, it's inevitable that we're going to have clashes. And I don't mind how, compatible you and your partner are, unless you're getting to kind of that type of relationship where you are a bit codependent and people are, you're commonly adjusting and conforming to meet the other partner. At the end of the day, you're two separate humans. You're two independent humans with totally different upbringings, totally different backgrounds, different genes, different epigenetic influences. and different wants and desires for your future, right? And you can be those different people, and you can move forwards together in this beautiful, harmonious way. And boundaries, I think, the thing that allows us to maintain, well, our standards in life for us personally, our standards, and of course, our safety. So when you hear your mind saying, oh, it feels too hard, or wanting to avoid the boundary and wanting to switch back into that accommodating mode, let that be the prompt of the little alarm bells going off in your head, and remind yourself, no, 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 I have a tool here I can use, and I'm safe. I'm safe to use this tool. This is not a hostile or hurtful thing to do. This is a loving thing that I'm doing. And if anybody thinks that it's a hostile or hurtful thing, then they are confused. But that's okay, because you are not confused. You do not need to be confused about what this boundary is about, where you're setting it from, why you're setting it. So with all of that being said, let's go on to talk about the communication, the actual boundary and action, as Kristeen said, and also what I think should be a necessary, mandatory step of planning a boundary. If you're in that position where you're planning a boundary, as Kristeen said before, we're kind of put on the spot a lot of the time with this stuff where we're like, whoa, that's an unacceptable thing to me. I didn't realize. I better do something about this. But when you're in the position where you're either looking at that situation in retrospect, or you've already learned a bit about yourself and you're planning to set a boundary in advance, maybe because, as Kristeen's asked you to do, you're thinking about a relationship you have right now that maybe there's some avoidance, maybe there's some resentment. There are some of those clues, those emotional clues that maybe it's time to set a boundary. That this step 2 is going to be one of the things that likely pulls you guys, my people pleasers, my friends and family with conflict avoidance. This is going to be one of the things that pulls you guys over the line and makes you feel safe to set this boundary. And we need you to feel safe. So let's first talk about the actual communication of the boundary, the way that if you choose to, you don't always need to communicate a boundary. Let's first talk about the communication. And then after that, we'll talk about this special step 2 that nobody ever tells you about boundaries, that you're getting as an exclusive as a part of this podcast. So Kristeen, you've had a recent, you were the one who thought that we should talk about the communication of the boundary. And I was like, oh, I don't know if that's a whole episode. Like there's not that much to it, is it? And then I went on talking about how you communicate boundaries in the wrong language. So Kristeen, let's talk about the place from which we communicate boundaries based on what we know about boundaries.
Well, I think the first thing that I've probably only really just realized whilst having this conversation with you as we're sort of recording this series is that there is a difference between setting a boundary and just disagreeing with someone. Like the emotional loading of a boundary is something that is, it's there to protect you and maintain a standard. It's about recognizing a standard and upholding a standard. Whereas just disagreeing with someone isn't really necessarily a process, right? So I guess just to delineate that for people who are listening, if you're in an argument with someone or you're just, kindly disagreeing with someone, that's not the same as setting a boundary. And a boundary is this more kind of something you need to give attention to. And I think in my own life where boundaries have come up and it's something that's emotionally activated me. And in the last episode, Becc had talked about how you might look after yourself in that situation, take time to reflect. And I was talking to Becc just before you came on about how I think there's 2 ways to handle this. So one, you plan for how you're going to show up when your boundary is crossed. But that usually, like we say, was about looking after yourself and going within, because in that moment, you might not say the perfect thing. But equally, you might have something that you have planned ahead of time that's very loving and you've got your little script and you can execute on it. So it just depends on what way you want to go. But I guess there's another approach, which is not allowing yourself, once you realize you have the boundary and you realize something's happened and you've reflected, sort of reaching out to that person to lovingly work through that boundary and just communicate, this happened and I felt this way when this happened. And the thing is, it's not usually about the other person. Usually whenever I have to set a boundary, it's because something has happened along the way. I've been socialized in some way. I've been hurt by someone else in some way. And my memory remembers things, my experiences that I've had in my life come back. And so it's usually not actually about the person that I'm setting the boundary with. It's usually about me. And so I think that can be helpful when actually communicating the boundary, is to keep it focus on yourself, I find, and just letting them say, like, I know this is not really your fault or problem, but it's just, this is what happened when this happened and I felt this way, and it would really help me or support me if you could do this. So I guess keeping the emphasis on yourself is something that I've found personally helpful. But like you say, Beck, this giving these strategies, we're talking about sort of loving relationships or respectful relationships at work or home or with family. We're not talking necessarily about abuse or violence or pathological situations. Obviously, there's professional help out there for those more nuanced scenarios, but just in your sort of run-of-the-mill daily life. And I think if you communicate at all, or you communicate in that way, it makes the other person feel safe and they're more likely to uphold your boundaries. What would you say about that, Beck? I mean, that's just something I've come to with life and doing it wrong a lot and then finding a way to do it better, I guess. What would you say is the best way to communicate a boundary?
I couldn't agree more with you. And I think really here, the phrase, I think it's from Brene Brown, clear is kind. Is that Brene Brown? I hate to misquote people, but clear is kind is a quote not from me, but from somebody who has had a lot of experience in this area, clearly, because a lot of us think that the directness of our communication is in some way cold or harsh. But in a lot of cases, when our boundaries have been crossed, when those lines have been crossed by another person in our lives, funnily enough, it is commonly the people whom we love and who love us too. Sometimes it's professional situations, sometimes it's strangers, of course, but a lot of the time, just by sheer proximity and the relationships, that the intimacy that we share with people who are close to us, it's often the people who love us who are crossing our boundaries that we're managing here. And then with saying that, a lot of the time the boundaries aren't crossed in a malicious way. There has been some kind of misunderstanding or miscommunication. And I just cannot iterate this point enough, apparently, that we are also different. And we make assumptions about other people all the time. Even though I feel like I know Kristeen to her core and bones, the truth is I'm making assumptions all day long about what I think I know about her, even from the most loving place. But that is just how humans work. We don't truly get to know the total inner workings of other people, including what their standards are and what their version of safety is as well, what feels safe and what feels unsafe to them. So when Kristeen talks about almost educating the other person in our lives about what our standards are and what our line of safety is with that too, what is in our acceptable circle and what is without, I always want to reach for that with the first step. Even just take me back to that silly situation with, the guy at the pub who's saying, to me, very unacceptable things. I still want to start with that communication first of saying, well, this is what I think, or this is what I think about why I think, you might want to reconsider what you've said. Now, that's not the boundary consequence. And actually, just like Kristeen tripped up when she was speaking too. And I'm saying this from from my place as well. When she was talking about saying, this is how I'd like you to change, or this is what I'd like for you to do. And, you might not have even overstepped there because you weren't necessarily saying that was the consequence. You were just having a communication after the fact, kind of in that education phase. But we want to be really clear. And again, I need to constantly remind myself that the boundary consequence is not, how is the other person going to change? How am I going to ask the other person to change? The boundary consequence is, how am I going to change? How am I going to act? what is the consequence that I personally am going to carry out in that situation? The boundary consequence is never asking, requesting, demanding that somebody else changes, because we cannot control other people. We are disempowered when we're saying you must change. This is actually really difficult to keep top of mind, because when I go out in the world and I am not fully conscious and I'm not watching my mind, I'm constantly falling back into the belief that I can control other people and that I just need other people to change and then I'll get to feel better. But I think, what Kristeen said here is just a beautiful almost next step of like, she's just, in whatever relationship she's talking about here, professional or personal, she's just revealed that there may either be some misunderstanding or some communication that could be that sort of education of like, this is what's important to me in this relationship that's clearly important to her enough to invest in having this conversation. And so she's taken this actually next step of engaging with the other person and then asking them if they will rise to this request, this want, this expectation. And then she gets to sit back and watch, how does this person respond in this situation? She can't control them, but she's like, it's important information for her to know. If I've asked for this and I've said it's important, will this person rise or not? It's really useful information that can come from boundaries, isn't it?
But I think there's a slight difference, and I actually love that you reflected that back to me in terms of the language I use. But I do think that there's whilst educating someone about your boundary, I think it does come with a more like a behavior or a way, like a standard to uphold. You're educating them on a standard, and like what you say, you're not trying to change the person, but you're trying to educate them on their standards, and it's like extending an invitation to meet you at your standard. So as much as yes, you cannot change people, but I think in order for the success of a boundary, that you understand each other more, I feel like once people are educated, the most natural response probably is the one that's like, oh, thanks for letting me know, and I understand that about you now. And I guess that's what you're hoping for. And none of that is changing the person, but it might change previous behavior or conversational style or something. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting nuance. Do you agree or disagree? Or yeah,
I do. I think if anything, I think if we talked about this more, we'd probably find that we've stepped into more of a nuance here. And I'm almost thinking about like, there's that ideal circle, and you're kind of creeping into that ideal circle. And you're like, if I'm going to have somebody occupy this important space in my life, if I get a choice about who occupies the space in my life, I want them to be showing up in the ideal circle. And if they show me over time that they're not able to show up in the ideal circle, that's important data. And maybe I'll choose someone else, choose somewhere else to put my energy.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I guess something else to touch on here is the fear we have. So, in terms of setting a boundary where we do want to communicate our new standard, I guess we'll make the sentence like that to make it more clear what we're trying to do. We're trying to communicate our new standard and see what the other person thinks and how they might respond to our new standard. Better language, I think. But that can feel scary. And the reason it can feel scary, I mean, in my own sort of life, there might be consequences at work. You might sever relationships. You may, in your romantic life, I always find that there's a part of me that worries, if I set this boundary, if I tell them my new standard, they'll leave me or something like that. So I feel like there's an element of fear that might hold you back from having that conversation. Or certainly, what I've personally done over time, just a pattern I recognize in myself, is I delay the conversation. And I'm talking about this, especially past Kristeen in her 20s. She'd delay any kind of conversation till there was just a breakup. That's also happened. Like we never had the conversation. The breakup just happened. Anyway, that's that. But in other relationships where I've tried to communicate a bit more and learned a bit more, I often delay the conversation so long until I just can't stand it anymore and I've reached a critical mass or something. And then at that moment, I've almost decided, well, I'm just going to have to be okay. Like if I have this conversation and that person does leave me, then I'm just going to have to be okay. So I've had to take myself to the absolute edge of this relationship and my worst fear happening or whatever it is that's holding me back, and accept that before I have the conversation. And pleasingly now, I think I'm a little bit different, and I am showing up and taking more risks and feeling a lot more safe with these conversations. But I'm just acknowledging that that's all the different variations of how you might be showing up when you're feeling fear. So can you expand a little bit more on that, Becc, in terms of what's holding us back from these conversations and how to have the conversation despite that?
Yeah, no, I I am guilty of the same. Hand up. It's it's I think that's often how people get to setting boundaries. It's the negative consequences of not setting them build up over time. And suddenly those consequences become way greater than, well, your fear of those consequences and wanting to avoid those consequences becomes greater than you're wanting to avoid actually setting and executing on the boundary as well. Well, exceeds that fear or that avoidance. So for me, and this is the second step that we invite you all to think about. So you've been thinking about throughout these episodes so far, a relationship that maybe you want to set some boundaries with. When you're setting your boundary, when you've got an inkling about what standard, what line might be being crossed, and you've decided, what am I going to do when that line is crossed? And a part of that, because the consequence is all about you when that line is crossed, will probably be you withdrawing. In a lot of cases with boundaries, it's simply removing yourself from the situation, be it physically or cognitively. And again, that's why I don't recommend boundaries as the first instance that much, because usually the consequence means that you just have to remove yourself. That's not always conducive with what you want. But now, the next step that we want you to think about is what's possible or likely for the other person's reaction to you executing on that consequence. How do you expect, or probably more to the point, how do you worry that another person will show up in that situation? And in my experience, in my client's experience, this comes down, in terms of what we worry about, comes down to two categories, I find. One is the other person being hostile to you, and two is the other person being hurt. So these are the two broad things that we can fear will result from us executing on a boundary. And therefore, the things that, as Kristeen's saying, can actually make us avoid or think we have no desire to set a boundary in the first place, because that seems too hard and too scary. And again, hello, people pleasers. Hello, my friends and family with conflict avoidance. We're speaking to you, and we're speaking from our hearts here. This doesn't feel like an easy thing. So we talked about in the last episode about how, I've had situations where I need to take care of myself. Where the first priority for me is actually in that situation where I've done the thing and then somebody's been hostile towards me. My first priority, if my nervous system is activated, is taking care of myself. Being in the situation where you're perceiving that somebody's hurt by you setting that boundary or, executing on the consequence, removing yourself from the situation, that can be equally as hard, because a lot of us have learned to take responsibility for other people's emotions, that other people being comfortable is the most important, and certainly more important than us being comfortable. And in this situation, it seems like you've done something and it's caused that hurt. It very much looks like there's a causal relationship there. And through mindset coaching, through this work that we can do with boundaries and with the, as we were saying, showing up in an unaffected and unattached way, in that empowered way as an alternative to boundaries. With this work, we can start to separate out our understanding that what we do affects other people and vice versa, that what they do affects us. This all comes beautifully part and parcel, but it can just be a rocky, messy road kind of detangling it. here. Yeah, so there's a lot in here to tackle. But broadly, we do want you to think about or just flag for you that these are very common things that stop us from even wanting to set a boundary in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's so important to recognize. But I think something else that you had actually mentioned before we came on air to record the podcast was something I just thought was so profound. And it was about not trusting the initial reaction as their true reaction. You said it a lot better. I've totally butchered it. But it was about sort of, you might get an emotional response from someone that might actually happen. And what's also true is that just because they had that reaction initially, it doesn't mean that they'll hold that reaction forever. Can you take us through that idea?
Absolutely. There's so much work to do in this space. That's so much of the work that I do. It's really beautiful work. So we talked about the hostility, and one of the challenges there is that we can feel unsafe. We can feel like that hostility is some kind of threat to us. We can see this hurt reaction, this wounded reaction by the other person, and we can think that we are the ones who caused that. Again, a misunderstanding. There's a misunderstanding about the threat to us in hostility. There's a misunderstanding about us hurting somebody else in the latter situation. And then there's this broader misunderstanding that because somebody's having an emotional reaction in the moment, that is reflecting what they really, truly think and believe and stand by. They really believe about you and your position to them, your relationship with them. So I do this thing, I've been doing my Ask Santa over the last, probably 5 years now. I've been doing Ask Santa. And for those of you guys who don't know about Ask Santa, go over to my Instagram and find the concept. It's so fun. It's life-changing. But I was using it again the other day in Officeworks, where I was buying a mesh router system for daredowling to make sure my internet was all smick and perfect. And I got the last box. And they were like, oh, yeah, we got one. We found it in the back. And they're like, it's just opened. It's like the seal was broken. It was open. And I was like, oh, why? And they were like, don't know. There's no note on here or anything. Not sure. And they were like checking it out. And I was like, wait a second. Can we find out why it was opened? I was on a time limit. I didn't want to get home and find that it was faulty or it had been used or there was a missing piece or anything. So I asked them again, and then one of them reassured me that no, we know it was just open. There's no fault or anything. Nobody's bought it. And I said, can I have a discount then? Because the box has been opened. And I was like, it's actually possible that this could end up being an inconvenience to me. It doesn't sound like the story is super clear about why the box was open. And they said, no, the box has just been open. We know that nothing's happened to it. And then they just went on doing their thing. And this is where my ask twice concept comes in. When people are put on the spot, their first reaction is often just going to be their normal practice programmed response, like a reflexive, unreflective response. Of course, they're going to say no to me the first time. It's way easier for them to just say no discount, no, easy, reflexive. I don't know if that's their true response or if it's just a reflexive response, unless I offer them more time to think about it. And so I asked twice. I asked again, may I please have a discount? And I gave them a reason this time. So the first time I didn't give the reason, the second time I did. And anyway, the second time the answer was yes, you can have a discount. And this isn't something that just has come up in that one situation, but I found it across my life in so many areas. Ask once, the answer will often be no. It'll just be the easiest to grab answer. Ask twice and the answer can change. Right. And I think what's happening here is not that I'm some very intimidating, like highly charismatic person or anything like that. I think what's happened is that their mind has had more of a chance to give something other than just the reflexive answer. And I like that concept here too, giving somebody that second chance to actually, they'll give you their first reaction. They might give you that emotional reaction. But when they, like us, see that emotion as a smoke alarm, to be like, oh, something's happening here. And then they actually go and look and they say, is this a threatening house fire or is this toast? They're just another human like us. They might find that they actually have a totally different reaction to our boundary execution, our consequence, than what they initially had, and a reaction that's more true to them and in their integrity. So again, you do not need to do this. You don't need to do it in every situation, but I personally I like to try and separate out people's immediate reactions from their true reactions, their true thoughts that are from their integrity.
That's so beautiful. Spoken by a true thought wizard. Just such a beautiful understanding of the human experience you have. Yeah, and I think that's so helpful. And of course, then depending on what the reactions are, and if you're getting the same, I guess, not ideal reaction, if that person's not meeting your standards again and again and again and again, then that gives you data and you can manage your decisions within that data set, I guess, is another way to look at it. But I feel like this has been so helpful, Becc. Like I said, earlier in the series, it might have been last episode. I've lost track of what I said and when and all the things. But I feel like no matter where you are, what stage of life you are, whether you've actually done work on this stuff before, whether you're brand new to it and you're still in that sort of people pleaser, conflict avoidance state, like I say, we're always setting new standards. We're always growing and evolving as we go through life. We're always gathering data and getting clarity on what is going to be good for us now and moving forward, and what's no longer going to be good for us and serving us. And so it just feels like this is a tool in the box, like just understanding this stuff and taking on board everything you've said, Becc, and applying it to boundaries. It just feels like there's a tool in the box now that we can continue to come back to and apply to various aspects of our life. And oh my goodness, we would love to hear what boundaries you guys are setting, and if this has been helpful, and if you have any questions, because we absolutely might be making some more episodes on this. Any suggestions welcome. Yeah.
I should make a bit of a summary page. There's so much information in this, isn't there? I'll make a bit of a summary page. I'll put it down below so you can sign up, and we'll make sure we send that out to you, because as I definitely find boundaries are something that I need to cognitively reflect on and come back to myself and make sure that I'm still aligned with the principles. Emotions are flying and I'm trying to work out what my standards are and all these things on the fly. There's something that I often reflect on, and I go back and make sure that I'm doing in a way that's really in the integrity of the concept, because that's what really serves me. And then also, like we said, that alternative, whenever you've got space to move towards that person who's not affected and doesn't need the boundary, because she's able to be the person who's in control of her experience and her behaviors and what she's thinking, regardless of what everybody is doing around them. So find the links to that down below. We'll make sure we hook you guys up so you can really start using these in your life.
And if you really are looking to do this work, then I highly recommend Dear Darling. I'm actually in the program, and I'm in the program not because Becc is my friend and we do the podcast together. That is not the reason I joined Dear Darling. I joined Dear Darling because this works. And I do feel like I'm now at that stage that you're talking about, where, and not in every situation, there will definitely be more, and I will definitely need your coaching. It was a weekly class. We come and get coached, and it's just so beautiful what you do in there. But I do feel like I have benefited from this, and I am now at the stage where I can absolutely be in my river a lot of the time, and people don't affect my emotional experience. And that is night and day from how I used to be. And it's a choice and it's a process. And Dear Darling is phenomenal. So I say that personally, I'm in the program, not just because I know Becc, but because it is a very special place, and come and hang out.
So beautiful. And Kristeen's got a great example that we'll have to talk about later in the series about you not using a boundary and going the empowered route. But we've got to go tonight. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we will see you in the next one. See you then. Bye.
I've been waiting all my life for something. I've been down the darkest roads and up in the clouds, but I've always felt that something's missing. find you right there in the crowd.
I can't get the stop button on YouTube.